Something is wrong with Lamar Jackson, and the Baltimore Ravens are desperately trying to pretend everything is fine. But the cracks are starting to show. The whispers are getting louder, and now a Ravens insider has blown the lid off what everyone in Baltimore has been too afraid to say out loud. The face of the franchise, the two-time MVP, the player who's supposed to carry this team to the Super Bowl, looks lost, uncomfortable, and frankly, not himself. And if the Ravens don't figure this out fast, their entire season could go up in flames before we even get to January. Let's set the scene because this story has more layers than your grandma's famous lasagna. The Ravens are riding high on a 4-game winning streak. They're 1 game behind the Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC North. On paper, everything looks great. They're winning games, staying in the playoff hunt, and positioning themselves for a potential division title run. But if you actually watch these games, if you look beyond the final scores and the highlight reels, you'll see something deeply unsettling. Lamar Jackson, the most electrifying player in football, the human cheat code who's been breaking ankles and breaking records since he entered the league, looks like a shell of himself. And people are starting to notice. Jeff Zrebiec, a respected Ravens insider who covers this team closer than anyone, just dropped a bombshell that has Baltimore fans spiraling into panic mode. He didn't just suggest that Lamar might be struggling, he flat out said it. The Ravens are uncomfortable watching their franchise quarterback look so unsettled. Those are not words you want to hear about your MVP caliber signal caller in the middle of a playoff race. Those are the words that send chills down the spine of every fan who's invested their hopes and dreams into this team. Because if Lamar Jackson isn't right, if he's not playing at his peak level, the Ravens don't just become beatable. They become mediocre, and mediocre doesn't win championships. So what exactly is going on? That's the million-dollar question, and the answer is complicated, messy, and more than a little concerning. Let's start with the injuries, because Lamar has been dealing with more bumps and bruises than a crash test dummy this season. He missed 3 games between weeks 5 and 8 with a hamstring injury. Not a little tweak, not something he could play through. A legitimate injury that kept him off the field for 3 weeks. That's a red flag right there because Lamar Jackson doesn't miss games. He's one of the most durable quarterbacks in the league. He plays through pain, he plays through contact. He's built different. So when he misses 3 games, you know it's serious. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Lamar comes back from the hamstring injury and suddenly he's dealing with knee issues. He missed practice time last week with a knee problem, which Zrebiec directly pointed to as a possible reason why Lamar hasn't looked like his usual MVP self. Think about that for a second. The guy is juggling injuries like he's running a medical circus, hamstring 1 week, knee the next. And we're supposed to believe that's not affecting his play? Come on. This is a quarterback whose entire game is built on mobility, explosion, and the ability to make defenders look foolish in the open field. If his legs aren't 100%, if he's hesitating even for a split second because of pain or caution, his entire game falls apart. And that's exactly what we're seeing. The numbers tell a story that should have every Ravens fan deeply worried. Since returning from the hamstring injury, Lamar Jackson has carried the ball only 8 times in 3 games. 8 times. Let me say that again for the people in the back. 8 carries in 3 games for a quarterback who built his reputation on being the most dangerous dual-threat player in NFL history. That's not a game plan decision. That's not the Ravens trying to protect their investment. That's a quarterback who physically cannot run the way he used to. Either he's still hurt, he's afraid of getting hurt again, or the coaching staff has made the decision to completely remove that element from his game. None of those options are good. And it's not just the lack of rushing attempts that's concerning. It's how Lamar looks when he's in the pocket, when he's making decisions, when he's under pressure. His most recent performance against the Cleveland Browns was borderline alarming. He went 14 for 25, which is a completion percentage that makes you wince. He threw for only 193 yards, which for a starting NFL quarterback in 2024 is basically pedestrian. And he threw 2 interceptions, which is the kind of mistake-prone performance we almost never see from Lamar Jackson. This is a guy who's usually surgical with the football, who makes smart decisions, who protects the ball like it's his firstborn child. But against Cleveland, he looked rattled, uncomfortable, and completely out of sync with his offense. Oh, and let's talk about the sacks. 5 times Lamar Jackson was brought down against the Browns. 5 times. That's not just a bad day at the office. That's a systematic failure of protection, and it's part of a larger, more terrifying trend. Lamar has been sacked 23 times in just 7 games this season. For context, he was sacked 23 times in 17 games last year. Read that again. He's been sacked the same number of times in 7 games as he was in an entire season last year. That's not just concerning. That's catastrophic. And it points to a much bigger problem that goes beyond Lamar's health. The offensive line is a disaster, and Lamar is paying the price with his body. Zrebiec didn't mince words about this either. He said Lamar has to compensate for an offensive line that looks overwhelmed on a weekly basis. Overwhelmed. That's the word he used. Not struggling, not inconsistent, overwhelmed. That means the guys up front who are supposed to protect the franchise are getting bullied, beaten, and embarrassed by opposing defenses. And when your offensive line is getting dominated, your quarterback becomes a sitting duck. It doesn't matter how talented you are, how quick your release is, how good your decision-making is. If you don't have time to throw, if you're constantly running for your life, if you're taking hit after hit after hit, eventually something breaks. And it feels like we're watching Lamar Jackson slowly break in real time. But here's what makes this situation even more maddening for Ravens fans. Baltimore is still winning games. They've won 4 straight. They beat the Browns despite Lamar's struggles. They're keeping pace with Pittsburgh. On the surface, everything looks fine. But that's the most dangerous part. Because winning ugly can mask serious problems, and those problems tend to explode at the worst possible time. You can get away with a struggling offensive line and a hobbled quarterback against mediocre competition. But what happens when the Ravens face the Steelers? What happens in the playoffs when they go up against the Kansas City Chiefs or the Buffalo Bills or one of the elite AFC teams? That's when these cracks become canyons, and that's when seasons fall apart. Zrebiec made another fascinating point that perfectly captures the impossible standard Lamar Jackson is held to. He said that Lamar has set such a high bar that the inevitable meh game here or there will stand out. In other words, Lamar Jackson's average game would be a career performance for half the quarterbacks in the league. But because he's been so consistently spectacular, because he's spoiled us with jaw-dropping plays and MVP-caliber seasons, even a slightly below-average performance feels like the sky is falling. And that's both a testament to how great he is and also a warning sign about the pressure he's under. When your margin for error is that small, when 1 or 2 bad games trigger panic and concern articles from respected insiders, you're operating on a razor's edge. And right now, Lamar is teetering on that edge. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the broader context, because this isn't just about one player or one position. The Ravens' entire offensive identity is in crisis. They're supposed to be this dominant, physical, run-first team that beats you into submission with power football and then unleashes Lamar to make explosive plays in space. But that formula only works when all the pieces are functioning. The offensive line needs to create holes for the running backs and protect the quarterback. The running game needs to set up play action. And Lamar needs to be healthy enough to hurt defenses with his legs. Right now, none of those things are happening consistently. The line is getting beat. The running game is inconsistent, and Lamar's mobility is a question mark. That's a recipe for disaster. And let's not forget about the numbers that actually look good, because they make this whole situation even more confusing. On the season, Lamar has thrown for 1,442 yards, 15 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. His completion percentage is 68%. His passer rating is 115.5. Those are objectively great numbers. Those are Pro Bowl numbers. So how can someone have stats like that and still be considered unsettled and concerning? Because context matters. Because the film doesn't lie. Because anyone who's actually watching these games can see that Lamar is not playing with the same confidence, the same explosiveness, the same swagger that makes him special. He's managing games instead of dominating them. He's surviving instead of thriving. And for a player of his caliber, that's unacceptable. The timing of all this couldn't be worse either. The Ravens are about to enter a critical stretch of their schedule. They face the New York Jets this Sunday, which on paper should be a get-right game. The Jets are a mess, a dysfunctional disaster of a franchise that's gifting wins to anyone with a pulse. But then comes Thanksgiving against the Cincinnati Bengals, who always play Baltimore tough. And lurking beyond that is the inevitable showdown with Pittsburgh, the team standing in the way of the Ravens' division title hopes. If Lamar isn't close to 100% by then, if the offensive line doesn't figure things out, if this unsettled version of the offense is what shows up in those big games, the Ravens are cooked. Period. There's also the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, but everyone is thinking. Lamar Jackson just signed a massive contract extension that made him one of the highest paid players in NFL history. That contract was supposed to lock in the Ravens' championship window, to guarantee that they'd have an elite quarterback for the foreseeable future. But what happens if his body starts breaking down? What happens if these nagging injuries become chronic issues? What happens if the wear and tear of his playing style finally catches up to him? Running quarterbacks have a shelf life. That's just the reality. And while Lamar has been remarkably durable for most of his career, these recent injuries and the noticeable decline in his rushing attempts are raising uncomfortable questions about how much longer he can sustain this style of play. Zrebiec was very clear about one thing. Lamar Jackson is the least of the Ravens' concerns. And on the surface, that's true. The offensive line is a bigger problem. The lack of depth at certain positions is a concern. The defense has had its own inconsistencies. But here's the thing. The Ravens can survive a mediocre offensive line if Lamar is playing at an MVP level. They can overcome depth issues if their franchise quarterback is making game-changing plays. But if Lamar is compromised, if he's not at his best, suddenly all those other problems become magnified. Everything falls apart. Because at the end of the day, the Ravens are built around Lamar Jackson. He is the engine that makes the entire machine run. And if that engine is sputtering, the whole car breaks down. The phrase that keeps echoing in my head from Zrebiec's report is that it's uncomfortable for the Ravens to see the face of their franchise look so unsettled. Uncomfortable. That's such a loaded word. It implies uncertainty, worry, maybe even fear. Because the Ravens know what everyone else knows. If Lamar Jackson isn't right, if he can't elevate his game when it matters most, their Super Bowl dreams are nothing but fantasy. They can beat the Jets and the struggling teams on their schedule. But when they face elite competition, when they're in the playoffs staring down the best teams in the AFC, they need Superman Lamar, not struggling through injuries Lamar. And right now, it's not clear which version they're going to get. Let's also talk about the mental aspect of all this, because injuries don't just affect you physically, they mess with your head. When you're dealing with a hamstring issue, you're thinking about every cut, every burst, every time you plant your foot. When you've got knee problems, you're hesitant about taking hits, about scrambling into traffic, about making the plays that used to come naturally. That split second of hesitation is the difference between a first down and a sack, between a big play and an incompletion. And you can see it in Lamar's game, the hesitation, the caution, the lack of that effortless explosiveness that used to make him must-watch TV every single week. He's in his own head, and that's almost as concerning as the physical limitations. The offensive line issues cannot be overstated. When Zrebiec says they look overwhelmed on a weekly basis, that's not coach speak or media exaggeration. That's a man who watches every snap, every practice, every film session, telling you that the guys up front are getting their butts kicked. And it's not like this is some secret. Everyone can see it. Opposing defenses are teeing off on Lamar, bringing pressure from every angle, and the offensive line is responding like a bunch of turnstiles at a subway station. They're getting beat inside. They're getting beat outside. They're getting beat with speed. They're getting beat with power. They're just getting beat, period. And until that gets fixed, Lamar is going to continue taking punishment, and this offense is going to continue to struggle. But here's the brutal truth that Ravens fans need to hear. Even with all these problems, even with the injuries and the struggling offensive line and the lack of rushing attempts, Baltimore is still 7-3. They're still very much in the playoff picture. They're still one of the better teams in the AFC. And that should tell you something about the talent on this roster and the coaching staff's ability to win games even when things aren't perfect. But it should also terrify you, because if this is what they look like when they're winning, what happens when they hit a rough patch? What happens when the schedule gets harder? What happens when they face teams that can actually exploit these weaknesses? That's when being uncomfortable turns into being panicked. The schedule ahead actually favors the Ravens in the short term. The Jets are a joke. Even a compromised Lamar Jackson should be able to carve up that defense. The Bengals on Thanksgiving will be tougher, but Cincinnati has its own issues, and Baltimore has owned that rivalry in recent years. But then you get into December, and that's when the real tests begin. That's when the Ravens will find out if they're legitimate Super Bowl contenders or just another good team that fades when the lights get brightest. And a huge part of that answer depends on whether Lamar Jackson can get healthy, regain his confidence, and start playing like the superstar everyone knows he can be. There's also the Tyler Huntley factor that's worth mentioning. When Lamar was out, the Ravens were able to win a game with Huntley under center. And while nobody is suggesting that Huntley is anywhere close to Lamar's level, it does raise an interesting question. If the Ravens can win games with their backup quarterback, does that take some of the pressure off Lamar? Does it allow them to be more cautious with his health? To give him extra time to heal? To not rush him back before he's truly ready? Or does it create an uncomfortable dynamic where people start wondering if maybe the system is more important than the player? That's dangerous territory, and it's exactly the kind of narrative that can spiral out of control if the Ravens aren't careful. Zrebica's report also mentioned that Jackson has to compensate for the offensive line issues, which is another way of saying he's doing more than he should have to. He's making plays in spite of his blockers, not because of them. He's extending plays, escaping pressure, throwing on the run, all the things that make him special but also put extra strain on his body. It's unsustainable. You can't ask your quarterback to be a magician every single play. Eventually, the tricks stop working. Eventually, the defense gets home. Eventually, you take a hit that you can't bounce back from. And with Lamar's injury history this season, that's a terrifying thought. The fact that this is even a conversation is wild when you think about it. We're talking about a two-time MVP, one of the most talented quarterbacks in NFL history, a player who single-handedly changed the way we think about the position. And yet, here we are, discussing whether he's unsettled, whether he's healthy, whether he can still be the player he once was. That's how quickly things can change in the NFL. One injury, one bad stretch of games, one struggling offensive line, and suddenly the narrative flips from MVP candidate to question mark. It's brutal, it's unfair, but it's reality. So what's the solution? How do the Ravens fix this? Step one is getting Lamar Jackson healthy. And I mean truly healthy, not just playing through pain healthy. If that means sitting him for a game or two, if that means being extra cautious with his workload in practice, then so be it. You'd rather have him at 100% for the stretch run and the playoffs than at 80% all season. Step two is fixing the offensive line, which is easier said than done. You can't just snap your fingers and make your linemen better, but you can scheme around their weaknesses, use quick passes, run more screens, get the ball out of Lamar's hands faster. Step three is restoring confidence, both in Lamar and in the offense as a whole. They need to remember what they're capable of, rediscover that swagger, and start playing like the Ravens team that everyone fears. But the clock is ticking. Every week that goes by with Lamar looking unsettled is a week wasted. Every game where the offensive line gets dominated is another opportunity for disaster. Every hit Lamar takes is another reason to worry about his long-term health. The Ravens are in a race against time, trying to get things figured out before it's too late. And if Jeff Zrebiec's report is any indication, there are people inside the organization who are genuinely concerned that they might not get there in time. The bottom line is this. The Baltimore Ravens are good enough to beat bad teams. They've proven that. But are they good enough to beat the elite teams when everything is on the line? Can Lamar Jackson overcome his injuries and his offensive line struggles to be the difference maker in big games? Will the face of the franchise shake off this unsettled feeling and return to MVP form? These are the questions that will define the Ravens season. And right now, nobody has the answers. Not the coaches, not the players, not the insiders, and certainly not the fans. All we can do is watch, wait, and hope that Lamar Jackson finds a way to be great again. Because if he doesn't, the Ravens' Super Bowl dreams are dead in the water. If you're a Ravens fan watching this, hit that like button if you're worried about Lamar. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on what Baltimore needs to do to get back on track. Do you think Lamar will bounce back, or are these injuries going to derail the entire season? And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is far from over, and you don't want to miss a single update as the Ravens navigate the most critical stretch of their season.